The candles in the great hall of Ashcombe Manor had already burned halfway down when Duchess Seraphina heard the carriage wheels stop outside her window. She knew that sound. She knew it the way she knew the creak of the east staircase, or the sigh of wind through the orchard. It meant her husband was home, and it meant he was not alone. She pulled her sleeve down over her wrist before she even realized she had done it. The habit was older than her marriage, older than this house, older than most of the servants who worked within its walls. She had been doing it since she was 11 years old, since the night a lamp had fallen in her family's cottage, and the fire had climbed her arm before anyone could pull her free. That was 15 years ago. The scars had long since healed into pale ridges of skin, but the reflex to hide them had never healed at all. Downstairs, she could hear Duke Alaric's voice, low and tired, and beneath it, the lighter, teasing tone of Lady Cassandra Whitlock. Seraphina did not need to see them to picture the scene. Cassandra would be laughing at something Alaric had said, her hand resting on his arm as though she had every right to it, and Alaric would be smiling the small, distracted smile he never gave his wife. Seraphina set down her needlework and walked to the window. Below, in the torchlight of the drive, she watched her husband help Cassandra down from the carriage, with the same careful hands he had never once offered her. It was not jealousy that rose in her chest. She had stopped feeling jealousy in the first year of her marriage, when she understood plainly that Alaric had married her for her family's fortune, and nothing more. What rose in her now was something quieter and more tired. It was the particular ache of being invisible in her own home. She had been raised to expect very little from marriage. Her mother had told her, on the morning of her wedding, that love was a luxury for women who did not need to survive. Seraphina's family needed to survive. The Ashcombe name needed money, and her family needed the protection of a noble house. And so the match had been made between two people who had spoken perhaps a dozen sentences to each other before the priest pronounced them husband and wife. In the 2 years since, Seraphina had built a life within that emptiness. She rose early to walk the grounds before anyone else was awake, when the mist still clung to the grass, and she could move freely, without worrying about long sleeves or high collars catching on a hedge and revealing what lay beneath. She spent her mornings with the household accounts, quietly correcting the mismanagement that had plagued the estate before her arrival. She spent her afternoons visiting the tenant families, bringing bread and medicine to the sick, sitting with new mothers, teaching the children their letters when their own parents had no time to spare. The staff of Ashcombe Manor had come to love her in a way they never dared say aloud, because everyone knew that the Duke's heart belonged elsewhere, and no one wished to draw his mistress's displeasure onto a servant's head. Cassandra Whitlock had been part of Alaric's life since before Seraphina had ever heard his name. She was beautiful in the practiced, gleaming way of women who had spent their whole lives being told that beauty was their only currency, and she spent it lavishly. She wore gowns cut to draw every eye in a room. She laughed loudly at gatherings, made sure her wit was quoted at every dinner table in the county, and made absolutely certain that everyone remembered exactly who held the Duke's affection, marriage certificate or not. From the moment Seraphina arrived at Ashcombe Manor as a new bride, Cassandra had made her contempt clear, though always in ways too clever to be called out directly. A comment about how plain the new Duchess's gowns were, a laugh, quickly stifled, when Seraphina stumbled over the correct fork at a formal dinner. A remark to a friend, said just loud enough to carry, wondering aloud what the Duke could possibly see in the little brown sparrow he'd been forced to marry. Seraphina heard these things. She always heard them. But she had learned, somewhere in the long, lonely nights of her first year of marriage, that dignity was the one thing no one could take from her unless she surrendered it herself. So she said nothing. She held her head high, thanked Cassandra politely when spoken to, and returned to her rooms to write letters to her mother that never once mentioned how she truly felt. Tonight, as she listened to the laughter drifting up from the entrance hall, she reminded herself of this same quiet discipline. She would go down, greet her husband and his guest, as courtesy demanded, and retire early. It was a routine so familiar, it had become almost comfortable, in the way that pain becomes comfortable when you have carried it long enough. She descended the staircase slowly, one hand trailing the polished banister, the other keeping her shawl close around her shoulders, despite the warmth of the evening. The entrance hall glowed with candlelight, and there, at its center, stood her husband and Cassandra, still caught in some private joke that ended the moment Seraphina's footsteps were heard on the marble floor. "Seraphina, Alaric's voice was courteous, nothing more. He straightened, putting a careful distance between himself and Cassandra that fooled no one. "You're still awake." "I was finishing some correspondence," Serafina said. "Good evening, Lady Cassandra." Cassandra's smile was sweet as poisoned honey. "Duchess, how lovely to see you, as always. I was just telling Alaric how tired you must be, managing this whole estate practically alone. It's such a great deal of work for someone with your constitution." There was a particular emphasis on that final word, and Serafina caught it, the way she caught every carefully aimed barb Cassandra sent her way. She was not sure exactly what constitution was meant to imply, whether Cassandra meant her modest upbringing or something else entirely, but she had long since stopped asking Cassandra to explain herself. Explanations only gave cruelty more room to breathe. "I manage well enough," Serafina replied evenly. "Will you be staying the night, Lady Cassandra?" "Only for supper," Cassandra said, looping her arm through Alaric's once more. "Alaric promised to show me the new horses in the north stable before I go. Didn't you, darling?" Alaric gave a small nod, not quite meeting his wife's eyes. "I did. Serafina, you needn't wait up." It was, in its way, a dismissal, gently worded, but unmistakable. Serafina inclined her head, bid them both a good evening, and climbed the stairs back to her rooms with the same steady grace she always managed, though her chest felt tight and her throat felt thick with something she refused to name as sorrow. She sat by her window long after the sounds of laughter faded from the stables below. She thought, as she often did in these quiet hours, of the fire that had shaped her arm and the fire that had shaped her life. She had been the one who pulled her younger cousin from the burning cottage that night, wrapping her own arm around the child to shield her from the flames, while their mothers screamed from the yard. She had never regretted it, not for one moment, not even as the burns healed into scars that would mark her for the rest of her days. But she had learned, in the years since, that the world did not always reward courage with kindness. Sometimes, it rewarded courage with silence, or worse, with mockery, from people who had never once risked anything for anyone. She thought about her husband too, though she tried not to dwell there long. Alaric was not a cruel man, not exactly. He was simply a man who had built walls around his heart so long ago that he no longer noticed they were there. She had seen glimpses of warmth in him, brief and rare, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Once, early in their marriage, she had fallen ill with a fever, and she remembered waking to find him sitting at her bedside, his hand resting near hers though not quite touching it, his face lined with something that might have been worry. He had left before she was fully awake, and neither of them had ever spoken of it again. She wondered, some nights, if that man still existed somewhere beneath the polished indifference he wore like armor, or if she had imagined him entirely. Down in the north stable, Alaric walked beside Cassandra among the horses, only half listening to her chatter about a mare she wished to purchase. His thoughts, unbidden, had drifted back to the staircase, to the brief flash of his wife's face in the candlelight before she turned away. There had been something in her eyes that night, something tired and guarded, and though he told himself it was none of his concern, a small, uncomfortable weight had settled in his chest that he could not quite explain away. He had married Serafina for reasons that had nothing to do with affection, and he had told himself, in the 2 years since, that this arrangement suited them both perfectly well. She managed the household with a competence that surprised him more often than he cared to admit. She asked nothing of him beyond civility. She made no scenes, voiced no complaints, and in exchange, he gave her the security of his name and the comfort of his estate. It was, by the standards of their world, a perfectly successful marriage. And yet, there were moments, small and fleeting, when he caught himself watching her across the dinner table, noticing the quiet efficiency with which she managed the servants, the genuine warmth in her voice when she spoke with the tenant children in the village. There were moments when Cassandra's laughter, once so charming to him, struck his ear as something brittle and calculated, though he could never quite say why. He pushed the thought away that night, as he pushed it away every time it rose, and returned his attention to Cassandra and the mare she wished to buy. It was easier, he told himself, to remain within the walls he had built, easier not to ask what might lie beyond them. Neither Alaric nor Serafina could have known, on that quiet autumn evening, that the walls between them were already beginning to crack, though neither one of them yet had the courage or the reason to see it. That reason would come soon enough, and it would arrive not gently, but in the cruelest and most public way imaginable, at the grand winter ball that the entire county was already beginning to whisper about with excitement. For now, the manor settled into silence, its Duke and Duchess each alone with their own private griefs, unaware that fate had already begun to draw the threads of their story tight, preparing for the night that would change everything between them. The letter arrived on a gray morning, sealed with the crest of Lady Cassandra's family, and Seraphina's hands trembled slightly as she broke the wax. It was an invitation, sweetly worded, asking the Duchess to join Cassandra for tea that afternoon at her townhouse in the county seat. Seraphina read it twice, searching for the trap she knew must be hidden somewhere in those polite curling letters, but she found nothing except an ordinary request that any two women of standing might exchange. She almost declined. Every instinct she possessed told her that accepting Cassandra's hospitality was like accepting an invitation from a fox to visit its den. But she had learned something else in her years at Ashcombe Manor, a lesson her mother had taught her long before the fire had ever touched her skin. Fear given a voice grows larger, fear left silent shrinks in the dark. So she sent back her acceptance before she could change her mind. And that afternoon she dressed carefully, choosing a gown with sleeves long enough to cover her arms completely, and set out for Cassandra's townhouse with her chin held high. The Whitlock townhouse was smaller than Ashcombe Manor, but decorated with a flamboyance that made the manor's quiet elegance look almost austere by comparison. Every surface seemed to gleam with gilt and polished silver. Every wall hung with portraits of Cassandra herself, in various flattering poses. Seraphina was shown into a parlor where Cassandra sat, already pouring tea, dressed in a gown the color of ripe plums, her dark hair arranged in perfect curls. "Duchess," Cassandra said warmly, gesturing to the seat across from her. "How good of you to come. I confess I wasn't certain you would." "Why would I not?" Seraphina asked, settling into the offered chair. "Oh, no reason at all." Cassandra's smile did not waver, though something calculating flickered briefly behind her eyes. "I simply thought perhaps you and I might come to understand one another better. We are, after all, both important parts of Alaric's life. It seems foolish for us to remain strangers." Seraphina accepted the cup of tea offered to her, holding it carefully in both hands, grateful for something to occupy her fingers. "I would welcome that, Lady Cassandra, if it is offered honestly." "Honestly," Cassandra repeated, as though tasting the word. "Very well. Let us be honest then. I have known Alaric for 6 years. I knew him before his father died, before the debts came due, before this marriage of convenience was ever arranged. I loved him then, and I love him now, and I do not intend to pretend otherwise simply because a piece of paper says he belongs to someone else." The words were delivered so evenly, so calmly, that it took Seraphina a moment to fully absorb their weight. She set down her teacup with careful precision, refusing to let her hand shake. "I am aware of your history with my husband," Seraphina said quietly. "I have never asked you to pretend anything, but I would ask that you remember, I am his wife, and this is my household as much as his." Cassandra laughed, a light, musical sound that carried no real amusement in it at all. "Your household? Yes, of course. Tell me, Duchess, do you know why Alaric never speaks of his feelings toward you at any gathering, in any letter, in any private moment shared with his closest friends? It is because there are none to speak of. You are a business arrangement, a ledger entry. I am the one he thinks of when he closes his eyes at night." Seraphina felt something hot and sharp rise in her chest, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "If that is true, then I wonder why you feel the need to say it to me at all, rather than simply enjoying whatever comfort you believe yourself to possess." For just a moment, something flickered across Cassandra's composed features, something that might have been surprise at the quiet steel in the Duchess's response. She recovered quickly, reaching for her own teacup with an elegant hand. "I say it," Cassandra replied, "because I have watched you these past 2 years, playing the dutiful little wife, charming the servants, visiting the sick children in the village, as though sainthood might somehow make Alaric love you. It is almost sweet, in its way, pathetic, but sweet. I simply thought it kinder to tell you plainly, rather than let you continue hoping." Seraphina rose from her seat, setting her teacup down with a controlled click against its saucer. "Thank you for your honesty, Lady Cassandra, however unkindly delivered. I believe I will take my leave now." "Running away so soon?" Cassandra asked, though she made no move to stop her. Not running, Serafina said, gathering her shawl around her shoulders. Simply recognizing when a conversation has reached its natural end. She walked from the townhouse, with her back straight and her steps measured, refusing to let Cassandra see anything but calm composure. It was only once she was seated safely inside her carriage, the door closed, and the horses beginning their journey home, that she allowed herself to press a trembling hand against her mouth and let the tears finally fall. She did not cry because she believed Cassandra's claims about Alaric's private feelings, though the words had certainly wounded her. She cried because some small, foolish part of her had begun, without her permission, to hope that her marriage might someday become something more than a business arrangement. Cassandra's cruelty had simply confirmed what Serafina already suspected in her most guarded thoughts, and confirmation, even of something already feared, could still cut as deep as any blade. By the time the carriage reached Ashcombe Manor, Serafina had composed herself once more, wiping her eyes and straightening her gown, before stepping down into the courtyard. She was greeted there by Mrs. Whitmore, the estate's longtime housekeeper, a stern-faced woman whose loyalty to Serafina had grown quietly fierce over the past 2 years. "Your Grace," Mrs. Whitmore said, studying the Duchess's face with the sharp attention of a woman who missed very little. "Are you well? You look pale." "I am simply tired," Serafina said, offering a small smile. It was a long afternoon. Mrs. Whitmore did not look convinced, but she was wise enough not to press further. "The young Pharaoh boy came by asking after you this morning. His mother has taken ill again, and he wondered if you might visit when you have the chance." The mention of the Pharaoh family pulled Serafina's thoughts away from her own troubles, and she felt a familiar sense of purpose settle over her tired shoulders. "I'll go this evening, before supper. Please have the kitchen prepare a basket of broth and bread." "Of course, Your Grace." As Serafina climbed the stairs to change out of her afternoon gown, she thought of little Peter Pharaoh, barely 7 years old, his eyes wide with worry over his mother's illness, and she felt the sting of Cassandra's words begin to fade beneath the simple, steady comfort of knowing she was needed somewhere, by someone, in a way that had nothing to do with ledgers or business arrangements. That evening, as she walked the familiar path to the Pharaoh cottage with a basket on her arm, she passed by the edge of the north stable and caught sight of Alaric, standing alone near the paddock fence, watching the horses graze in the fading light. He looked up as she passed, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. "Serafina," he called out, taking a step toward her. "Where are you headed?" "To visit the Pharaoh family," she said, pausing though every instinct urged her to keep walking. "Mrs. Pharaoh has taken ill again." Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of something she could not quite name. "You visit them often?" "Someone should," she said simply. "The nearest physician is 2 hours away, and they cannot afford his fees regardless." Alaric was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she had rarely seen from him, something almost like curiosity. "I did not know that." "There is a great deal you do not know," Serafina said, though she said it without malice, simply as fact. "Good evening, Alaric." She continued down the path without waiting for a response, and behind her, Alaric remained standing at the paddock fence, watching her small figure grow smaller in the distance, the basket swinging gently from her arm. He found himself, for reasons he could not fully explain, unwilling to look away until she disappeared entirely from sight. Snow had begun to fall over Ashcombe Manor by the time winter settled fully into the county, and with it came the flurry of preparations for the season's grand events. Serafina found herself busier than ever, overseeing the household's daily demands, while also managing the quiet crisis that had grown among the tenant families as the cold deepened and supplies grew thin. She rose before dawn most mornings now, wrapping herself in a heavy cloak before making her way down to the kitchens to organize baskets of food and firewood for the families struggling most. The Pharaoh family remained foremost in her mind, though Mrs. Pharaoh's illness had thankfully begun to improve, with the medicine Serafina had quietly arranged to have sent from the county's finest physician, paid for from her own private allowance without her husband's knowledge. It was during one of these early morning kitchen visits that Mrs. Whitmore found her, sleeves rolled up, carefully portioning dried meat into cloth sacks for delivery to the village. "Your Grace, you needn't do this yourself," Mrs. Whitmore said, though her tone carried more fondness than reproach. "The kitchen staff can manage the baskets." "I know," Serafina said, tying off another sack with practiced fingers. But it gives me something useful to do with my hands, and I find I think more clearly when I am working. Mrs. Whitmore studied her for a long moment. Something troubling you, Your Grace? Serafina paused, considering how much to share. She had grown to trust Mrs. Whitmore over the past 2 years, more than she trusted almost anyone else within the manor's walls. But there were still some things too painful to speak aloud, even to a friend. Just thinking of the winter ball, Serafina said finally, which was true enough, even if it was not the whole truth. It will be a large gathering this year. The Duke mentioned that half the county has already accepted their invitations. And Lady Cassandra will be among them, no doubt, Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice carefully neutral, though her eyes carried a sharpness that suggested she understood more of the household's private tensions than she ever spoke of aloud. No doubt, Serafina agreed quietly. She had not told Mrs. Whitmore, or anyone, about the conversation in Cassandra's parlor weeks earlier. The wound from those words had not fully healed, though Serafina had done her best to bury it beneath the demands of her daily work. She told herself, in her quieter moments, that Cassandra's cruelty meant nothing, that a woman who needed to wound others, simply to feel secure in her own position, was hardly worth the pain she caused. But knowing this intellectually, and feeling it in her heart, were two very different things, and some nights, alone in her rooms, the old doubts crept back, regardless of how firmly she tried to reason them away. The preparations for the winter ball consumed the household for weeks. Serafina oversaw every detail with the same careful attention she gave to the estate's ledgers, coordinating with the cook on the evening's menu, arranging for musicians to travel from the county seat, and ensuring the great hall was polished and decorated to reflect well on the Ashcombe name. It was, in truth, the first grand event she had organized entirely on her own since her marriage, and though she would never have admitted it aloud, she took a quiet pride in the work, hoping perhaps that Alaric might notice the effort she had poured into making the evening a success. Alaric, for his part, had grown increasingly distracted in the weeks leading up to the ball, though not entirely for reasons connected to Cassandra. His steward had brought troubling news of a dispute with a neighboring landowner over grazing rights, a matter that threatened to become costly and drawn out, if not handled with care. He spent long hours locked in his study poring over old land deeds and correspondence, and Serafina found herself seeing even less of him than usual, their paths crossing only briefly at supper, before he retreated once more to his papers. One evening, several days before the ball, she brought a tray of tea to his study herself, rather than sending it with a servant as was customary. She found him hunched over a scattering of documents, his hair disheveled from repeatedly running his hands through it, dark circles beginning to shadow his eyes. "You should rest," she said, setting the tray down on a clear corner of his desk. "You've barely slept this week." Alaric looked up, surprised to see her there, rather than a servant. "Serafina, I didn't realize it was so late." "It's nearly midnight," she said gently. "The land dispute will still be there in the morning, whether you sleep or not." He rubbed his eyes, studying her for a moment, with an expression she could not quite read. "You've grown quite good at running this household without my involvement at all." "Someone had to," she said, though not unkindly. "You've had a great deal to manage." "Yes," he said quietly. "I suppose I have." There was a pause between them, longer than usual, filled with something neither of them seemed quite ready to name. Serafina almost turned to leave, but something in his expression made her linger a moment longer. "Thank you," Alaric said finally, "for the tea, and for everything else, I imagine, that I have failed to notice." It was such a small thing, such an ordinary sentence, but it struck Serafina with unexpected force. In 2 years of marriage, she could count on one hand the number of times he had offered her genuine gratitude for anything at all. "You're welcome," she said softly, and left him to his papers before either of them could say anything more. That night, lying awake in her rooms, Serafina found herself thinking not of Cassandra's cruel words or the exhausting preparations for the ball, but of the brief, unexpected warmth in her husband's voice. It was a small thing, she reminded herself. A single sentence, spoken out of simple courtesy rather than any deeper feeling. But it was enough, that night, to let her sleep peacefully, for the first time in weeks. The morning of the winter ball arrived cold and clear, sunlight glittering off the fresh snow that blanketed the grounds. Serafina spent the day in a whirl of final preparations, checking every detail twice, ensuring the flowers arranged for the great hall had arrived fresh despite the season, tasting the evening's dishes to confirm they met her standards, and finally retreating to her rooms in the late afternoon to prepare herself for the evening ahead. Her maid, a kind young woman named Alice who had served her since her arrival at Ashcombe Manor, helped her into a gown of deep sapphire blue, its long sleeves trimmed with delicate silver embroidery. Serafina studied herself in the mirror, noting the way the gown's high neckline and long sleeves concealed everything they needed to conceal, allowing her to move through the evening, as she always did, safe within her careful armor of fabric and composure. "You look beautiful, Your Grace," Alice said, arranging the final pins in Serafina's dark hair. "Thank you, Alice," Serafina said, though her mind had already begun drifting toward the evening ahead, toward the crowd of nobility who would fill the great hall, toward the near certainty that Cassandra would be among them, dressed to outshine every other woman present, including the Duchess whose home was hosting the event. She had no way of knowing, as she descended the staircase that evening to greet her first arriving guests, that this night would become the one she would remember for the rest of her life, not for its careful planning or its glittering decorations, but for the moment when everything she had spent 2 years carefully hiding would be torn away before the eyes of the entire county, and for the single, unexpected act that would follow it. The great hall of Ashcombe Manor blazed with candlelight by the time the first guests began arriving in their carriages, the frozen drive lined with torches to guide their way. Serafina stood beside Alaric at the entrance, greeting each arrival with practiced grace, her hand resting lightly on his arm, as custom demanded. To any observer, they might have appeared the picture of a contented noble couple, though both of them knew better. The hall itself glittered with silver and crystal, the long tables laden with dishes Serafina had spent weeks planning, musicians tuning their instruments in the gallery above. Nobility from across the county filled the space, their voices rising in a pleasant hum of conversation and laughter, the scent of roasted meats and mulled wine drifting warmly through the air. Cassandra arrived fashionably late, as she always did, sweeping into the hall in a gown of deep crimson that left little doubt about her intention to command every eye in the room. She greeted Alaric with a familiarity that made several older guests exchange knowing glances, though she offered Serafina only the barest, most perfunctory of curtsies. "Duchess," Cassandra said, her smile bright and sharp. "What a lovely gathering. You've truly outdone yourself." "Thank you, Lady Cassandra," Serafina replied evenly. "I'm glad you could join us." The evening progressed much as such evenings always did. Guests moved between conversation and dancing, wine flowed freely, and the musicians filled the hall with lively music that drew couples onto the polished floor. Serafina moved among her guests with quiet competence, ensuring every need was met, every glass refilled, every dish replenished before it could run empty. She danced twice with Alaric, as custom required, his hand light at her waist, his expression carefully neutral, though she noticed him watching her more closely than usual throughout the evening. It was well past the midpoint of the celebration, when Cassandra approached her near the refreshment table, a glass of wine already half consumed in her hand, her cheeks flushed with the particular boldness that came from drinking freely among friends who would never dare to correct her. "Duchess," Cassandra said, her voice carrying just slightly louder than necessary, drawing the attention of several nearby guests. "I must say, that gown is quite becoming on you. Such long sleeves, though, for such a warm hall. Are you not uncomfortable?" Serafina felt the familiar prickle of warning along her spine, the same instinct that had guided her through 2 years of Cassandra's careful cruelties. "I find the temperature quite comfortable, thank you." "How curious," Cassandra continued, her voice still carrying that dangerous edge of volume. "I've always wondered, Duchess, why you favor such modest fashions. Surely a woman of your position could afford gowns in the current styles, with sleeves that end at the elbow, as most ladies here tonight are wearing." Several guests nearby had begun to notice the exchange, their conversations quieting as they turned to listen. Serafina felt her composure beginning to strain under the weight of the gathering attention, but she kept her voice steady. "I simply prefer this style," she said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I should see to our other guests." She turned to walk away, but Cassandra's hand shot out, catching the fabric of her sleeve in what appeared, to any casual observer, like an accidental grasp meant only to detain her a moment longer. But Serafina, who had spent 2 years learning every nuance of Cassandra's calculated cruelty, saw the deliberate twist of her wrist a heartbeat before it happened. The fabric tore, with a sound that seemed impossibly loud, in the sudden hush that had fallen over the nearby guests, the delicate silver embroidery ripping away from the seam, exposing Serafina's forearm to the candlelit hall. For one suspended moment, nothing happened at all. Serafina stood frozen, her torn sleeve hanging useless at her side, her scarred arm bared for the first time in years before anyone outside her closest household staff. The twisted ridges of old burn scars ran from her wrist, nearly to her elbow, pale and unmistakable in the golden light. Then the whispers began. "Oh," Cassandra said, her hand flying to her mouth in an expression of theatrical horror that fooled absolutely no one who had witnessed the deliberate motion of her wrist. "Oh, I am so terribly sorry, Duchess." "I had no idea. How dreadful. Are those scars?" The whispers spread outward through the hall like ripples across still water, guests turning to see what had caused the commotion, their eyes widening as they took in the sight of the Duchess's marked arm. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed on her behalf. Others stared openly, their faces a mixture of shock and poorly concealed curiosity. "How unfortunate," Cassandra continued, her voice pitched to carry across the suddenly quiet hall, "that the Duchess of Ashcombe should carry such marks. I do hope, Your Grace, that you'll forgive my clumsiness. Though I confess I understand now why you always keep yourself so carefully covered. Some things are perhaps best kept hidden from decent company." The cruelty of the words landed like a physical blow. Serafina felt heat rushing to her face, humiliation coiling tight in her chest, as dozens of eyes remained fixed upon her exposed arm, upon the scars she had spent 15 years learning to hide from a world that had taught her, again and again, that such marks made her less than whole in the eyes of polite society. She reached instinctively for the torn fabric, trying to gather it back over her arm, her hands trembling despite every effort to steady them. She could feel tears beginning to gather at the edges of her vision, hot and humiliating, and she fought desperately against them, refusing to let this moment break her composure entirely, in front of the assembled nobility of the entire county. Somewhere nearby, she heard a young noblewoman whisper to her companion, not quite quietly enough, "How horrid. I had no idea the Duchess was so disfigured. No wonder the Duke spends so little time in her company." The words cut deeper than Cassandra's calculated cruelty ever had, precisely because they came from a stranger, someone with no personal stake in her humiliation, simply repeating what seemed, in that moment, like the obvious and universal judgment of the entire room. Serafina felt something inside her chest crack, some careful wall she had built over years of quiet endurance, beginning to crumble under the weight of so many watching eyes. She looked, almost helplessly, toward where her husband stood across the hall, and found him already staring at her, his face frozen in an expression she had never seen him wear before, some complicated mixture of shock and something else, something she could not yet identify. For one terrible, endless moment, Serafina believed he would say nothing at all. She had spent 2 years learning not to expect his defense, not to hope for his intervention in matters that touched her most private wounds. And in that instant, standing exposed before the entire assembled nobility of the county, she braced herself for the crushing disappointment of his continued silence. But then Alaric began to move. Time seemed to slow as Alaric crossed the great hall, his boots striking the polished floor with a steady, deliberate rhythm that cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade through silk. Every eye that had been fixed on Serafina's exposed arm now turned toward him instead, the whispers shifting, uncertain, as the assembled guests tried to guess what the Duke intended to do. Serafina watched him approach, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone nearby must hear it. She had spent the last several heartbeats bracing herself for further humiliation, for some polite but distant remark that would confirm what Cassandra and the whispering guests had already decided about her. She did not expect what happened next. Alaric stopped directly before her, close enough that she could see the tightness in his jaw, the barely contained fury flickering behind his eyes, though when he spoke, his voice was calm and clear enough to carry across the entire silent hall. "Are you hurt?" he asked her quietly, his gaze searching her face, rather than her arm. The question, so simple and so unexpected, nearly undid the last of Serafina's composure. No one had asked her that in 15 years. Everyone who saw her scars asked about the scars themselves, about how she'd gotten them, about how unfortunate they were, about how she must feel to carry such marks. No one asked if she was hurt in this moment, if this particular wound, the one being inflicted before an entire hall of strangers, had caused her any pain. "No," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am well." Alaric held her gaze for a long moment, as though searching for the truth beneath her words. And then, without another word of explanation to anyone watching, he reached up and unfastened the clasps of his own formal coat. The hall fell utterly silent, every guest watching in confused fascination, as the Duke of Ashcombe slipped the heavy coat from his shoulders. He moved with quiet, unhurried purpose, and Seraphina stood frozen, uncertain what he intended, until he stepped closer and gently draped the coat over her shoulders, arranging it with careful hands to cover her exposed arm completely. The fabric was warm from his body, heavy with the weight of his family's crest embroidered along the collar, and Seraphina felt something in her chest give way entirely at the simple, unexpected tenderness of the gesture. She had not been touched with such gentleness by her husband in the entire 2 years of their marriage, and certainly never in front of witnesses. "There," Alaric said softly, adjusting the coat's collar with a steadiness that belied the fury still simmering just beneath his calm exterior. "Better." Seraphina could only stare up at him, too stunned to speak, as murmurs of astonishment rippled through the watching crowd. She saw Cassandra's face across the hall, her earlier expression of theatrical horror now replaced by something far more genuine, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her carefully composed features, as she realized the evening was not unfolding as she had planned. Alaric turned then, his hand settling protectively at Seraphina's back, and faced the assembled guests who filled his great hall. His expression, when he looked out at them, had lost every trace of the distant civility he usually wore at such gatherings. What remained was something harder, something that made even the boldest of the noble guests shift uncomfortably beneath his gaze. "It seems," Alaric said, his voice carrying easily across the now utterly silent hall, "that some of you have found tonight's entertainment in my wife's misfortune. I would like to correct whatever impression Lady Cassandra's clumsiness may have left among you." Cassandra's face had gone quite pale, though she attempted a small, uncertain laugh. "Alaric, darling, it was merely an accident, I assure you. I never meant—" "I did not ask you to speak," Alaric said, without raising his voice, though the words landed with enough force to silence Cassandra instantly. He turned his attention back to the crowd, his hand still resting at Seraphina's back, steady and unmoving. "I think it is time this hall understood exactly what those scars represent, since so many of you seem eager to whisper about their appearance, rather than ask about their origin." Seraphina's breath caught. She had never told him the full story, not in any detail, though she supposed the household staff must have mentioned it at some point, or perhaps he had simply pieced it together from fragments over the years. She had certainly never expected him to speak of it now, here, before the entire county. "My wife," Alaric continued, his voice steady and clear, "earned these marks not through carelessness or misfortune, but through courage. When she was a girl of 11, a fire broke out in her family's cottage in the night. Her younger cousin, a child of only 4 years old, was trapped inside a room, already filled with smoke and flame. Seraphina did not wait for the grown men of the household to organize a rescue. She ran into that burning building herself, wrapped her own body around the child to shield her from the flames, and carried her out to safety, though the fire caught her arm before she could escape entirely." The hall remained utterly silent, every guest listening now with an entirely different quality of attention than the cruel curiosity that had gripped them moments before. "The child she saved," Alaric continued, "grew up healthy and whole, and is, I am told, expecting her first child this coming spring. She owes her very life to the courage my wife showed that night, courage that left permanent marks upon her arm, that she has carried with quiet dignity ever since, never once seeking pity or admiration for what she did, simply living her life and continuing to serve this household and its people with the same selfless devotion she showed as a child." He paused, letting his gaze travel slowly across the assembled crowd, lingering for just a moment on Cassandra's stricken face before continuing. "I would ask," Alaric said, his voice hardening slightly, "how many of you, standing here tonight, in your fine gowns and expensive jewels, have ever risked so much for another person's life? How many of you have run toward danger rather than away from it? Sacrificed your own comfort and beauty for someone else's survival? I suspect the answer, for most gathered here tonight, is very few indeed. No one spoke. Several guests had lowered their eyes, unable or unwilling to meet the Duke's steady gaze. Serafina felt tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, though these tears carried none of the humiliation of moments earlier. They came instead from something entirely different, something warm and overwhelming that she had not felt in longer than she could remember. "My wife's scars," Alaric said, his voice softening slightly as he turned back to face her, "are not a mark of shame. They are a mark of exactly the kind of character this house, and this county, should be proud to call its own. I am ashamed that it has taken me this long, and this particular evening, to say so plainly." Serafina looked up at him, tears still tracing silent paths down her face, and for the first time in 2 years of marriage, she saw something in her husband's eyes that looked remarkably like genuine tenderness, unguarded and unmistakable, offered freely, before the eyes of every noble family in the county. The silence that followed Alaric's words stretched long enough that Cassandra's wineglass slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering against the polished floor, with a crash that seemed to echo through the entire hall. Every head turned toward the sound, and Cassandra stood there, her face drained of color, surrounded by shards of crystal, and a spreading pool of dark red wine that looked, to more than one observer, uncomfortably symbolic of the evening's turn. "Alaric," she said, her voice higher now, edged with something close to panic. "You cannot mean to embarrass me, before the entire county over a simple accident." "Was it an accident, Cassandra?" Alaric asked, turning to face her fully, his voice quiet, but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut through her protest entirely. "I have known you for 6 years. I know precisely how deliberate your movements can be when you wish them to appear otherwise." A murmur rippled through the crowd at this, several guests exchanging glances that suggested Alaric was not the only one who had noticed the calculated nature of Cassandra's earlier gesture. Cassandra opened her mouth to protest further, but seemed to think better of it under the weight of so many watching, judging eyes. "I think," Alaric continued, "that it is time you and I had a conversation that should have taken place long before tonight." He turned to Serafina then, his hand still resting gently at her back. "Will you excuse me for a moment? I promise I will return shortly." Serafina, still wrapped in the warmth of his coat, still processing the astonishing turn the evening had taken, could only nod. She watched as Alaric led Cassandra away from the center of the hall, toward a quieter alcove near the tall windows, their voices dropping too low for the surrounding guests to hear clearly, though everyone in the hall strained subtly to catch whatever fragments they could. Mrs. Whitmore appeared at Serafina's side almost instantly, her weathered face creased with concern and something like fierce pride. "Your Grace, come sit down! You've had a terrible shock!" "I'm quite well, Mrs. Whitmore, truly," Serafina said, though she allowed herself to be guided toward a nearby chair regardless, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her, despite her words. Several of the noble guests approached her in the following minutes, their earlier whispers of judgment now replaced with something closer to genuine warmth. An older gentleman she recognized as Lord Pemberton bowed low before her, his expression solemn. "Your Grace," he said, "I must apologize for my earlier lack of discretion. I did not know the full circumstances, and I spoke thoughtlessly among my companions. Please accept my sincere regret." Serafina, still somewhat overwhelmed, managed a small nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you, Lord Pemberton. It is forgiven." Similar apologies came from several other guests over the following quarter hour, though Serafina noticed that not everyone in the hall seemed equally moved by Alaric's speech. A cluster of younger noblewomen near the refreshment table continued their quiet conversation, their eyes occasionally flicking toward the alcove where Alaric and Cassandra remained in heated discussion, their expressions suggesting more curiosity about the unfolding scandal than any genuine reconsideration of their earlier judgments. Near the alcove, the conversation between Alaric and Cassandra had grown increasingly tense. Serafina could not hear the words clearly from her seat, but she could read the shape of the exchange well enough in their postures, Cassandra's hands moving in increasingly agitated gestures, Alaric standing rigid and unmoving, his arms crossed, his expression unyielding in a way she had rarely seen from him before. "You cannot simply cast me aside over this," Cassandra was saying, her voice low, but sharp with desperation. 6 years, Alaric. 6 years of my devotion, and you would throw it away because I made one small mistake with a fabric sleeve? This was not one small mistake, Alaric replied, his voice equally quiet, but far steadier. This was the culmination of 2 years of cruelty toward my wife that I allowed to continue because I was too distracted, or too cowardly, to address it properly. Tonight simply made it impossible to continue ignoring. She is nothing, Cassandra hissed, her composure finally cracking entirely. A plain little country girl who happened to inherit a fortune. I have given you 6 years of my life, Alaric. 6 years of loving you honestly, and you would choose her, choose duty and obligation, over genuine affection? Alaric was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of realization that seemed to surprise even himself. I do not know yet what I choose, Cassandra, in terms of my own heart, but I know with absolute certainty that I will no longer allow you to treat my wife with the contempt you have shown her these past 2 years. That much, at least, ends tonight. And what of us? Cassandra asked, her voice barely above a whisper now, stripped of its earlier bravado. There is no us, Alaric said, and something in his tone made it clear the words were final. There has not been an us since the day I married her, Cassandra, whatever comfortable fiction we allowed ourselves to maintain in the months since. I think it is time we both acknowledge that truth honestly. Cassandra stared at him for a long moment, her carefully painted face a mixture of fury and genuine heartbreak that made Serafina, watching from across the hall, feel an unexpected flicker of something almost like pity, despite everything Cassandra had done to earn her contempt. You will regret this, Cassandra said finally, gathering the shredded remains of her composure around herself like a cloak. When the novelty of playing the devoted husband fades, and you remember exactly what a dull, colorless life you have chosen for yourself, you will regret this. Perhaps, Alaric said quietly, but it will be my regret to bear, not yours to inflict. Cassandra turned without another word and swept from the alcove, making her way through the hall with as much dignity as she could muster, though her rapid, uneven steps betrayed the true state of her composure. She did not stop to bid farewell to any of the guests she had spent the evening charming, nor did she glance again toward Serafina, seated quietly near the center of the hall, still wrapped in her husband's coat. The great front doors closed behind her with a heavy, final sound, and for a long moment, the entire hall remained silent, absorbing the magnitude of what had just occurred beneath its roof. Then, slowly, conversation began to resume, quieter now, more subdued, as the musicians in the gallery, sensing the shift in mood, began a gentler melody than the lively dances that had filled the earlier hours of the evening. Alaric crossed the hall once more, this time without hesitation, and knelt beside Serafina's chair, taking her hand in both of his own with a gentleness that made her breath catch in her throat. I am sorry, he said quietly, meant for her ears alone. I am sorry it took me this long, and this particular evening, to see clearly what I should have understood from the very beginning of our marriage. Serafina looked down at their joined hands, at the warmth of his coat still wrapped around her shoulders, and felt something long frozen within her chest begin, very slowly, to thaw. News of the winter ball spread through the county faster than any rider could carry it, passed from household to household in the particular way that scandal always travels among people with little else to occupy their conversation during the long winter months. By the time a week had passed, Serafina had received no fewer than a dozen letters from noblewomen she barely knew, some offering awkward apologies for their earlier judgments, others simply expressing curiosity about the details of that remarkable evening. She answered each letter with careful, measured politeness, neither confirming nor denying the wilder rumors that had begun circulating, some claiming that Alaric had challenged another nobleman to a duel over the insult to his wife, others insisting that Cassandra had fled the county entirely in disgrace. The truth, Serafina found, was rarely as dramatic as the stories people preferred to tell, though the actual events of that evening had certainly changed something fundamental in the rhythm of her household. Alaric had begun seeking her out with a frequency that still felt strange and unfamiliar after 2 years of careful distance between them. He appeared in the estate office some mornings, not to review the ledgers she managed so competently, but simply to sit nearby while she worked, occasionally asking questions about the tenant families or the daily operations of the household that he had never before shown much interest in understanding. "Tell me about the Farrow family," he said one such morning, settling into the chair across from her desk with a cup of tea he had poured for himself. An act of casual domesticity that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier. Serafina looked up from her ledgers, surprised by the request. "Mrs. Farrow has been ill through most of the winter, though she's recovering well now. Her husband works the eastern fields, and they have 3 children, the eldest a boy named Peter, who is quite clever for his age. You've been paying for a physician to visit them," Alaric said. It was not quite a question, though there was curiosity beneath the statement. "I have," Serafina admitted, wondering briefly if she should have sought his permission before spending from her private allowance in such a way, though the thought passed quickly. She had never needed his permission before, and she was not about to start seeking it now, simply because their marriage had shifted into something warmer. "Good," Alaric said simply, and something in his tone suggested genuine approval rather than mere tolerance. "I should like to meet them properly, if you would introduce me. It seems I have been rather blind to the actual needs of the people who depend on this estate." Serafina studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any trace of performance, any sense that this newfound interest was merely a temporary reaction to the drama of the winter ball, rather than a genuine shift in his character. She found none. His expression carried the same quiet seriousness she had glimpsed in him only rarely before, the same seriousness that had led him to remove his own coat before the assembled nobility of the county, rather than allow her humiliation to continue unchallenged. "I would be glad to introduce you," she said finally. "We could visit this afternoon, if you have the time." "I will make the time," Alaric said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any elaborate promise could have managed. They walked together that afternoon, along the snow-covered path toward the village, Alaric matching his pace to hers, rather than striding ahead as he might once have done, his hands clasped behind his back, as he took in details of the estate he had apparently never fully noticed before. The condition of the fences, the state of the tenant cottages, the small signs of both prosperity and struggle, scattered across the land he had inherited, but never truly studied. Peter Farrow answered the cottage door himself, his eyes widening at the sight of the Duke standing beside the familiar Duchess, who had become such a regular and welcome presence in their small home. "Your Grace," the boy said, offering an uncertain bow that made Alaric's mouth twitch with something close to a smile. "Peter, isn't it?" Alaric said, crouching slightly to bring himself closer to the boy's height. "I understand you're quite clever with your letters. The Duchess speaks well of your progress." Peter's face brightened considerably at this praise, and he launched into an eager, rambling account of the words he had recently learned to write, pulling Alaric by the sleeve toward the small table where his lesson slate still sat from that morning's practice. Serafina watched with quiet wonder as her husband knelt beside the boy, examining his careful letters with genuine attention, asking questions about his lessons that revealed a patience she had rarely witnessed from him in their 2 years of marriage. Mrs. Farrow, still pale from her long illness but steadily recovering, emerged from the cottage's back room to find the Duke of Ashcombe seated at her kitchen table, deep in conversation with her young son about the proper formation of the letter G. She looked toward Serafina with an expression of astonished gratitude that needed no words to convey its full meaning. They stayed nearly an hour longer than Serafina had originally planned, and by the time they finally walked back toward the manor in the fading afternoon light, Alaric seemed quieter than usual, lost in thoughts he did not immediately share. "You've built something remarkable here," he said finally, as the manor came into view ahead of them. "A genuine bond with these families. I confess I never understood, until today, how much of the estate's true well-being has depended on your quiet work, rather than my distant management." "They are good people," Serafina said simply. "It costs little to show them kindness, and it returns a great deal in loyalty and genuine well-being for everyone on this land. I would like to understand more of it," Alaric said. "If you would be willing to teach me." Serafina glanced sideways at him, studying the earnest quality of his request, so different from the distant courtesy that had defined their marriage for so long. "I would be glad to," she said, and found that she meant it entirely. That evening, as they sat together at supper, a comfortable silence settled between them that felt entirely different from the strained, careful silences of their earlier marriage. Alaric spoke of the land dispute with his neighboring landowner, asking her opinion on how best to resolve it, genuinely listening to her thoughts rather than simply nodding politely before proceeding with whatever plan he had already decided upon alone. It was, Serafina realized as she climbed the stairs to her rooms that night, the first truly peaceful evening she had spent in her marriage, free from the constant background hum of loneliness that had colored every previous supper they had shared. She did not yet know what this new warmth between them might grow into, whether it represented a genuine and lasting change, or simply a temporary reaction to the shock of recent events. But she allowed herself, for the first time in 2 years, to hope that it might be the former. Cassandra Whitlock had not been idle in the weeks following her humiliation at the winter ball. Word reached Ashcombe Manor, carried by a stable hand who had a cousin working in the Whitlock household, that Cassandra had begun a quiet campaign of her own, visiting several prominent families in the county, attempting to reshape the narrative of that evening into something more favorable to her own reputation. The attempt largely failed. Too many guests had witnessed the deliberate twist of her wrist, the calculated cruelty of her earlier remarks, and Alaric's public declaration had left little room for reasonable doubt about where the true fault of that evening's events truly lay. Invitations that had once arrived regularly at the Whitlock townhouse began to grow scarce, and several families who had previously welcomed Cassandra's company found themselves suddenly and mysteriously too occupied to receive her calls. It was Lord Pemberton, of all people, who delivered the most decisive blow to Cassandra's remaining social standing. At a gathering held at his own estate some weeks after the winter ball, he made a point of publicly and pointedly inquiring after the Duchess of Ashcombe's health and well-being, praising her courage and character, in terms clear enough that no one present could mistake his meaning. Cassandra, who had been in attendance hoping to rebuild some fragment of her reputation, left the gathering early, her face pale with the recognition that her standing among the county's noble families had been irreparably damaged. Serafina heard these accounts secondhand, through Mrs. Whitmore's careful reporting of servants' gossip and the occasional letter from acquaintances eager to share the latest development in what had clearly become the county's favorite topic of conversation. She found herself feeling less satisfaction in Cassandra's downfall than she might once have expected. There was a certain hollow quality to revenge, she discovered, even revenge she had not actively sought, that made it feel less triumphant and more simply sad. "You look troubled," Alaric observed one evening, as they sat together in the manor's smaller parlor, a fire crackling warmly in the hearth beside them. "I thought news of Cassandra's declining fortunes among the county families might bring you some satisfaction." "I suppose I expected it might," Serafina admitted, setting aside the book she had been only half reading. "But mostly, I simply feel tired of the whole matter. I would rather move forward than continue dwelling on what she did, or what has become of her since." Alaric was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression of genuine consideration. "That is, I think, a far more generous response than she deserves. But it is also, I suspect, precisely the sort of response that has always defined your character, whether the world around you noticed it or not." Serafina felt warmth rise in her cheeks at the simple sincerity of the compliment, still unaccustomed to receiving such open appreciation from her husband after so long without it.
"Have you heard from her at all, since that evening?"
"Once," Alaric said. "A letter, several weeks ago, asking whether I might reconsider my decision, whether enough time had passed that we might quietly resume our previous arrangement without further scandal." Serafina's breath caught slightly, old anxieties stirring, despite the peaceful weeks that had passed since the ball. "And what did you tell her?" "That there would be no resuming anything," Alaric said simply. "That whatever affection I once believed I held for her, I have come to understand, it was built on very shallow ground indeed. Nothing like the genuine respect and growing affection I have discovered for my own wife these past weeks." The words settled over Serafina like warm sunlight after a long winter, and she found herself unable to speak for a long moment, overwhelmed by the simple sincerity of his declaration. "You need not say such things simply to comfort me," she managed finally. "I say them because they are true," Alaric said, reaching across the small distance between their chairs to take her hand in his own. "Serafina, I have spent 2 years failing to see the woman I actually married, distracted by old habits and old comforts that meant far less than I once believed. I do not wish to continue that failure any longer." Serafina studied their joined hands, the warmth of his fingers wrapped around her own, and felt something settle deep within her chest, a quiet certainty that had been entirely absent from her marriage until these recent weeks. "I have spent 2 years learning to expect very little from this marriage," she said honestly. "It will take some time, I think, for me to fully trust that this change is lasting, rather than temporary." "I understand," Alaric said. "I do not expect that trust to arrive quickly, nor do I believe I deserve it, without first proving myself worthy of it, through consistent action, rather than mere words. But I intend to spend however long that requires, Serafina, because I have come to believe that you are precisely the sort of partner I should have valued from the very beginning of our marriage." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, the fire crackling softly beside them, their joined hands resting between their chairs, and Serafina found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely looking forward to whatever the coming months of her marriage might bring, rather than simply enduring them, as she had grown so accustomed to doing. In the weeks that followed, Cassandra's presence faded almost entirely from the county's social gatherings. Rumors eventually circulated that she had accepted an invitation from distant relatives to spend the remainder of the winter season in a neighboring county, seeking to rebuild her reputation, somewhere her recent humiliation had not yet become common knowledge. Whether this rumor proved true or not, Serafina found she genuinely did not care to follow the details any further. Her attention, increasingly, had turned toward matters far more immediate and far more precious than the fading fortunes of a woman who had once caused her so much quiet pain. Spring arrived at Ashcombe Manor with a gentleness that seemed to mirror the quiet transformation taking place within its walls. The snow melted from the fields in slow, steady stages, revealing the dark, rich earth beneath, and the tenant farmers began their annual preparations for planting, their spirits lifted by the promise of warmer days ahead. Serafina found herself walking the grounds each morning with a lightness in her step that had been entirely absent during the long, cold months of her early marriage. Alaric had continued his newfound involvement in the estate's daily affairs, joining her regularly on visits to the tenant families, learning the names of children he had once passed without notice, asking thoughtful questions about crop yields and household needs that revealed a genuine desire to understand the land and people he had inherited responsibility for. Their evenings, once marked by strained silence or his complete absence, now passed in comfortable conversation, sometimes about estate matters, sometimes about nothing of consequence at all, simply the small observations and shared thoughts that accumulate between two people, growing genuinely close to one another. One particular morning, as pale spring sunlight streamed through her bedroom window, Serafina stood before her mirror, examining her reflection with a thoughtfulness she had not allowed herself in years. Her hand drifted, almost unconsciously, to the sleeve of her gown, tracing the fabric that still, out of long habit, covered her scarred arm completely. A soft knock sounded at her door, and Alaric's voice followed. "Serafina, might I come in?" "Of course," she said, turning as he entered, still dressed in his morning riding clothes, his cheeks flushed from the cool spring air outside. "I wondered if you might join me for a ride this morning," he said. "The orchards are beginning to bloom, and I thought you might enjoy seeing them before the blossoms fade." Serafina smiled, genuine warmth filling her at the simple thoughtfulness of the invitation. "I would like that very much." As she reached for her riding gloves, she paused, studying the long sleeves of the gown she had already selected for the day, the familiar armor she had worn, without conscious thought, for 15 years of her life. Something in the gentle spring light, in the quiet security of the months that had passed since the winter ball, made her hesitate. "Alaric," she said slowly, "would you mind terribly if I wore something with shorter sleeves today? The morning seems warm enough for it." Her husband's expression shifted, understanding dawning in his eyes as he recognized the true weight behind her simple question. "I would not mind at all," he said gently. "I would consider it an honor, actually, if you felt comfortable enough to do so." Serafina turned to her wardrobe, her heart beating a little faster than usual, and selected a gown she had not worn since before her marriage, its sleeves ending gracefully at the elbow, leaving her forearms bare. She dressed slowly, deliberately, and when she finally turned to face her husband, she felt a vulnerability unlike anything she had experienced since that terrible, transformative evening at the winter ball. "You look lovely," Alaric said simply, offering his arm to escort her downstairs, his gaze never once drifting toward her exposed scars, with anything resembling the pity or discomfort she had spent a lifetime bracing herself against. They rode together through the orchards that morning, the trees heavy with delicate white and pink blossoms, petals drifting occasionally on the gentle breeze like soft snow. Several tenant workers, already at their labor in the nearby fields, looked up as the Duke and Duchess passed, offering respectful waves that Serafina returned with genuine warmth, no longer troubled by the sight of her own bare arm, resting easily against the reins. "Do you remember," Alaric asked, as they paused their horses near the edge of a small stream that wound through the orchard's northern boundary, "the evening of the ball, when I told the entire hall the story of how you earned those scars?" "I remember," Serafina said quietly. "I don't believe I will ever forget it. I have thought often, in the months since," Alaric continued, "about how differently our marriage might have unfolded, had that particular evening never occurred. I fear I might have continued in my careless indifference indefinitely, never truly seeing you, never understanding what a remarkable woman I had married." "We cannot know that for certain," Serafina said gently, "but I confess, I have wondered the same thing myself, more than once." "I am grateful, in a strange way, for that terrible evening," Alaric said, "not for the pain it caused you, which I deeply regret allowing to happen in the first place, but for the clarity it forced upon me, the recognition of exactly what I stood to lose through my own blindness." Serafina reached across the small distance between their horses, resting her bare hand against his own. "I am grateful as well," she said, "though I would not wish to relive that particular humiliation. I cannot deny that it led us here, to this moment, riding together through blooming orchards, with nothing hidden between us any longer." Alaric lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her scarred forearm with a tenderness that brought fresh tears to her eyes, though these tears, like so many she had shed in recent months, carried nothing but genuine happiness. "I love you, Serafina," he said quietly, the words simple and unadorned, carrying a sincerity that needed no further embellishment. "Not despite your scars, and not because of some misguided notion of duty toward the woman society decided I must marry. I love you because you are brave, and kind, and stronger than anyone I have ever known, and I have been a fool not to recognize it from the very beginning of our marriage." "I love you too," Serafina said, the words emerging with an ease that surprised her, though she supposed she had been building toward this admission for weeks now, ever since that first quiet evening, when he had brought her tea to his study, and thanked her for everything he had failed to notice. "I did not expect to, when we first married. I did not believe I would ever have reason to. Yet here we are," Alaric said, smiling at her, with a warmth that had transformed his entire bearing, since that fateful evening months earlier. "Here we are," she agreed, and together, they continued their ride through the blooming orchard, the spring sunlight warm on their bare arms, the past year's pain finally beginning to feel like something distant and conquered, rather than a wound, still actively bleeding. The county's summer gathering, an annual celebration held at the grandest estate among the local nobility, arrived nearly a full year after the winter ball that had so thoroughly transformed the marriage of the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe. Serafina dressed for the occasion with none of the careful anxiety that had once accompanied such preparations, selecting a gown of pale gold silk with sleeves that ended gracefully above her elbow, leaving her scarred forearm bare and unhidden for the first time at such a large and prominent gathering. Alice, still serving as her maid after all these years, fastened the final clasps of the gown with a proud smile. "You look radiant, Your Grace." "Thank you, Alice," Serafina said, studying her reflection with a calm confidence that would have seemed impossible to imagine a year earlier. Alaric waited for her at the bottom of the staircase, dressed in formal attire befitting the evening's importance, his expression brightening the moment he caught sight of her descending toward him. "You are breathtaking," he said simply, offering his arm as she reached the final step. "You say that every time I dress for an evening out," Serafina said, though she could not suppress the small smile his words always brought to her lips. "Because it remains true every time," Alaric replied, pressing a gentle kiss to her hand, before they made their way toward the waiting carriage. The estate hosting the summer gathering glowed with warm evening light by the time their carriage arrived, its gardens filled with the soft murmur of arriving guests, and the gentle strains of music drifting from open windows. Serafina stepped down from the carriage with her husband's steady hand supporting her, her bare arm resting easily against the fabric of her gown, no longer concealed, no longer a secret she felt compelled to guard from curious eyes. Several guests who had witnessed the events of the previous winter ball approached them almost immediately, their greetings warm and genuine, in a way that would have seemed unimaginable a year prior. Lord Pemberton, whose own public support had done much to restore Serafina's standing in the difficult weeks following her humiliation, greeted them both with genuine affection. "Your Grace," he said, bowing to Serafina with evident respect, "you look wonderful this evening. I trust the year has treated you and the Duke kindly?" "Exceptionally kindly, Lord Pemberton," Serafina replied, glancing toward Alaric with a warmth that needed no further words to convey the true depth of her happiness. "Thank you for asking." As the evening progressed, Serafina moved through the gathering with an ease and confidence that drew admiring glances from guests who remembered, all too well, the humiliation she had endured at the previous year's ball. Where once whispers had followed her through such gatherings, now she found herself genuinely welcomed, her scarred arm no longer an object of pity or cruel curiosity, but simply an accepted part of who she was, a mark of courage that the county's nobility had come to respect rather than mock. Cassandra Whitlock, Serafina had heard through occasional passing mentions, had married a minor nobleman from a distant county some months earlier, settling into a quiet life far removed from the social circles she had once dominated so thoroughly. Serafina felt no particular satisfaction or resentment upon hearing this news, simply a distant sort of acknowledgement that the woman who had once caused her such pain had found her own path forward, as everyone eventually must. Near the midpoint of the evening, as the musicians began a slower, more intimate melody, Alaric drew Serafina onto the dance floor, his hand settling at her waist with the easy familiarity of a husband who had grown to know his wife's every gesture and expression over the past year of genuine partnership. "Do you remember our first dance together, at our wedding?" Alaric asked, guiding her gently through the familiar steps. "I remember it felt like dancing with a stranger," Serafina admitted honestly. "You barely looked at me the entire time." "I regret that more than I can properly express," Alaric said, "though I am grateful, every single day, that we found our way past that particular beginning, to something far better than either of us could have imagined at the time." Serafina looked up at her husband, at the genuine warmth and affection that had become such a constant presence in his expression over the past year, and felt her heart fill with a happiness she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. "I am grateful as well," she said, "for all of it, even the painful parts. They led us here, after all, to this moment." As they continued their dance, other couples moving gracefully around them beneath the glow of countless candles, Serafina caught sight of her own bare arm resting against her husband's shoulder, the scars that marked her skin no longer hidden, no longer a source of shame, but simply a visible testament to the courage that had always defined her character, courage that had ultimately led her husband to see her clearly, and to love her fully, for exactly who she truly was. The county whispered still, from time to time, about the remarkable evening when the Duke of Ashcombe had removed his own coat before the assembled nobility to shield his wife from humiliation, and about the profound transformation that had followed in the marriage everyone had once dismissed as a cold and distant arrangement of convenience. But Serafina no longer concerned herself with whispers, whether cruel or admiring. She had learned, through the painful trials of that transformative year, that true worth was never determined by the judgment of others, but by the quiet courage to remain true to oneself, scars and all, until the world finally learned to see the strength in what it had once mistaken for weakness. And as the music continued to fill the warm summer evening, and her husband held her close with a tenderness that had become as natural to him as breathing, Serafina finally allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that she had found not merely a marriage of convenience, but a genuine and lasting love, built upon the solid foundation of honesty, respect, and the simple, powerful act of one person choosing, at last, to truly see another.